Hello, everyone, and welcome. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay, hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the 86th meeting of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Review Committee. My name is Melanie O'Brien, and I am the designated federal official to the Review Committee. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded. The recording, transcripts, and meeting minutes will be made publicly available after this meeting and will include the names of those in attendance. If you object to this, you may disconnect at this time. This is a public meeting of the Federal Advisory Committee established by the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, of 1990. And this meeting is held under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, FACA, and its implementing regulations. This meeting was noticed in the Federal Register on October 3rd, 2023. An agenda for this meeting and the materials are posted to the NAGPRA program events page. The Secretary of the Interior issued a charter for this review committee in November 2022, which governs the objectives and scope of the committee's activities. The purpose of the review committee is to monitor and review the inventory and identification process and repatriation activities under sections 5, 6, and 7 of the Act. The review committee is also responsible for reporting to Congress on the progress and any barriers encountered in carrying out its responsibilities. FACA requires that advisory committees membership be fairly balanced in terms of points of view represented and functions to be performed. To achieve this, NAGPRA requires that the review committee be comprised of 7 members, 3 members nominated by national museum organizations and scientific organizations, 3 members nominated by Indian tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, and traditional Native American religious leaders, with at least 2 such persons being traditional Indian religious leaders, and 1 member appointed from a list of persons developed and consented to by all the other members. Members are appointed by the Secretary of the Interior and serve as advisors to the Secretary on NAGPRA issues. Currently, the review committee has 7 appointed members. Mr. Toby Patrick, a traditional Indian religious leader, was appointed by the Secretary of the Interior on June 1st, 2023, and is with us today for his first meeting. With that as an introduction, I'd like to start with a roll call of the committee members. Please answer out loud. Holly Aloha Ayau.
Aloha.
Dominique de Beaubien. Present. Timothy McEwen.
Present.
Armand Minthorn.
Here.
Toby Patrick.
Here.
Shelby Tisdale. Here. Angela Garcia Lewis. Angela informed me that she would be unable to participate in today's meeting, but she is listening via phone. The charter for the review committee does not contain a quorum requirement, and a meeting may be held with fewer than 7 members in attendance. As a designated federal official, I have determined that this meeting could proceed with only the 6 members in attendance. I would like to acknowledge the individuals who are assisting me in conducting today's meeting. With me are 2 attorneys from the Department of the Interior Office of the Solicitor, Brady Blasco with the Division of Parks and Wildlife, and Stephen Simpson with the Division of Indian Affairs. From the National NAGPRA program, Lisa Koszalski is the review committee coordinator who is responsible for organizing this meeting and preparing the minutes and transcripts of these proceedings. With that, I hereby call this meeting to order. Before we begin our agenda for today, I believe the committee would like to open with a traditional opening. Toby, I believe you have agreed to provide that opening.
Yes, I like to take this time to sing the song from our area here. Hmm.
Just a few words here before we begin. We're asking our Creator today to guide our thoughts and our words. We're asking Creator today to watch over our family and our friends. And we ask Creator today to help us go forward, one day at a time, one step at a time, one word at a time. And that our Creator will watch over us, this work that we do. And that the Creator can help us as a team and help us go forward. Truly thankful today for all the people that are involved. This is a wonderful work. And we ask Creator today to help us with this work. Thank you.
Um,
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
uh,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Moving on to the first agenda item today is a selection of a chair. Under the Act and the current charter, the review committee is responsible for designating one of its members to chair the committee. Under the committee's meeting procedures, the review committee opted to select a chair and a vice chair who serve 2-year terms. On November 12th, 2021, Tim McEwen was selected as vice chair. On January 5th, 2023, Holly Aloha Ayau was selected as chair of this committee, but with a caveat that he would only serve until a full committee was appointed. As a selection of the chair is a responsibility of the committee, I now turn this discussion over to the committee.
We'll entertain nominations for chair.
This is Tim McEwen. I would like to nominate Halealoha Ayau as chair.
Are there any more nominees? A last call. And any additional nominees before we? Okay, having heard none, Melanie, does that mean we still vote or I'll just continue?
We can
No.
just continue. That's fine. Yes, it's up to you to designate a member. If anyone is opposed to designating Holly Aloha Ayau as chair, you can speak up. I think that settles it, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I appreciate it, members. I think we also should accept nominations for vice chair, since I believe Tim's term is expiring this month prior to our next meeting.
Yes, that is correct.
All right, so members, nominees for vice chair.
Tim, are you interested in continuing your role as vice chair?
I would be willing to do that until June, whatever the day of the end of my term, but I would urge everybody to make sure that this position is filled when I go.
Agreed.
I'd be glad to nominate Tim as vice chair until his term expires.
Tim McEwen has been nominated for vice chair until his term expires. Are there any other nominees for vice chair? Okay, having heard none, all in favor of Tim McEwen for vice chair, say aye.
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 And I abstain.
I believe the ayes have it, and thank you, Dr. Tumukian, for continuing as vice chair of the review committee. Turn the agenda back over to you, Melanie.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll continue on to the next item on the agenda, which is a report from the National NAGPRA program. To begin my report on the National NAGPRA program, I'd like to first describe the responsibilities that are delegated to the program by the Secretary of the Interior. The program manager is charged with publishing notices in the Federal Register, receiving and recording inventories and summaries as required by NAGPRA, and providing advice and assistance to NAGPRA constituents. The program manager provides staff support on civil penalties, administers grants to tribes and museums, and drafts regulations to implement NAGPRA. Finally, the program manager serves as the designated federal official to the review committee. As the manager, I am only able to carry out these delegated responsibilities because of the dedicated staff of the National NAGPRA program. Joining me today on this call is our small but mighty team: David Barlin-Lyles, the investigator; Lori Jennings, the documents and reports coordinator; Lisa Koshelsky, the review committee coordinator; Angie Miller, grants management specialist; Mariah Soriano, compliance and website coordinator; and David Tarler, training enforcement and regulations coordinator. I really am deeply indebted to each and every one of these individuals for the work that they've done over the last year and over the last several years in supporting me as the manager of the program. I would like to provide the committee with a brief update on the work of the National NAGPRA program as of the end of the fiscal year 2023. Our fiscal year in the federal government begins on October 1st and ends on September 30th. We have not published our annual program report for fiscal year 2023, which ended on September 30th, 2023, but we hope to do so before the end of this month and prior to your next meeting. We have published our annual data visualizations on Tableau, which you can access through the NAGPRA program website, and I will ask Lisa to post a link in the chat. And of course, you can always access up-to-date real-time data through the NAGPRA program website and our databases, which are updated in real time as notices are published and documents are updated and entered. By every measurement, this has been a record-breaking year for the National NAGPRA program and for the larger NAGPRA community. As the administrative and bureaucratic arm of this process, we have a very unique perspective on the work of repatriation across the country. And while these program reports may come across as a lot of numbers and statistics, I'm reminded every day that with each notice that gets published and every inventory that is updated, it means that another ancestor is closer to being respectfully returned. As you're all very well aware, this year we were pleased to return to holding in-person review committee meetings after our long COVID hiatus at Indiana University. We were pleased to be able to reconvene in person again, and along with the rest of the world, we continue to try to navigate this new hybrid world within the limits of our staff capacity and federal technology. Meeting minutes, transcripts, as well as recordings from the June meeting are available on our website. As you are also aware, the department published proposed regulations in October 2022. The deadline for public comment was in January of 23. We received a large number of public comments, a total of 181 submissions. And on September 21st, 2023, the Office of Management and Budget began its review of the final rule, which is the last step in the rulemaking process. The department still hopes that the final rule will be published before the end of the calendar year, December 2023. In fiscal year 23, Congress appropriated the largest amount of grant funding in the history of the NAGPRA program, $3.4 million. The grant program supports two types of grants: project grants for up to $100,000 for consultation and documentation programs or projects, and repatriation grants of up to $15,000 for direct repatriation expenses. We announced grant awards in August to 16 Indian tribes and 28 museums. Unfortunately, the request for grant funds still exceeded the funds that were available. We received applications requesting over $4 million, and several grant applications were not awarded this year. On a positive note, however, in addition to being the largest amount ever appropriated for NAGPRA grants, it was also the largest number and the largest amount awarded for repatriation grants. We awarded 21 grants totaling over $271,000. Along with the grant program carrot comes the civil penalty stick of NAGPRA. The program receives, evaluates, and investigates allegations that museums have failed to comply with the requirements of NAGPRA. In fiscal year 23, we received 13 allegations of failure to comply. In addition, the program has fielded an increasing number of requests for assistance with general enforcement actions, generally from members of the public. And we are continuing to work with both the specific cases that come into our office, but also on our process and protocols for handling both allegations as well as these inquiries and requests for assistance. And we continue to provide advice and assistance to anyone who requests it through phone calls or emails to our program inbox, nagpra_info@nps.gov. With general increased attention and information about NAGPRA in the media and in the general consciousness, we have seen an increase, a significant increase in requests for assistance on a wide variety of NAGPRA issues. Each call and email that comes into our office can require a significant amount of time to first figure out really what the problem is, but then to assist with a proper resolution. And while we are always happy to assist with questions, we also encourage anyone seeking information to first consult our website, especially the training resources we have available. We are currently working on new training resources to accompany the publication of the final regulations. So be sure to check our website for new resources over the coming months. The program continues to work very closely with museums and federal agencies to update and amend inventories and summaries and to ensure that the databases are accurate. Our inventory data, which comes directly from the documents submitted by museums and federal agencies, has always been publicly available through our databases, and since 2020 has been in more accessible formats available to download. We do want to note one change in how we reported inventory data this year. A large number of human remains were pending publication on September 30th, 2023. About just a little over 4,000 ancestors were pending notice publication at the end of the fiscal year. So in the report for this year, we are showing those as the status of those human remains as pending publication to reflect that large number that was almost to the finish line of a notice. I'm also want to point out to the committee, and I'm very pleased to report that although the total number of human remains reported under NAGPRA continued to increase again this year, as it has in the past, the number of human remains that have completed the NAGPRA process for consultation and notification under the regulations has finally crossed the 50% mark to 55%. And for the first time in 33 years, fewer than 100,000 ancestors, 96,488 to be exact, are still pending consultation and notification under the regulations. So I realize that many people may feel that even one ancestor in a holding or collection is far too many. I am pleased to report that this downward trend reflects progress in our overall goal of facilitating the respectful return of these human remains. And finally, the biggest record we broke this year was in notice publication. Again, while the number of ancestors and those that are resolved through the notification process, we see as a barometer of repatriation work generally. Notices are the ultimate sort of end of that process. We received 475 notices this year, and we published 446 notices. For several years now, I've reported to the committee that notice submissions have been increasing, and this year was no exception. In fact, this year blew every other year out of the water. We have received and published 2 times as many notices as any other year in the history of NAGPRA. We issued new templates for notices last year, which we feel probably helped in assisting museums with filling out notices. It certainly helped us in the speed at which we could review notices and publish them. And I again note for the audience that the closer a notice is to the template, the faster it is for us to review it and submit it for publication. We process notices in the order in which they are received. So I encourage everybody to tell your friends, stay as close to the template as you can, and that'll help everybody in line. Again, I want to commend the staff of the National NAGPRA program and our support within the Department of the Interior for all of the work that has allowed us to achieve so much this year in all of the areas that we are responsible for. And with that, I will be happy to answer any questions that the committee has about the work of the National NAGPRA program.
Members, questions?
For the chart. The template thing, that's on the webpage.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, Melanie. Will there be any projected increase in grant funding over the next fiscal year or the next couple of fiscal years?
I can't answer that question. Grant funding is through the congressional appropriations process, which happens every year, and in fact has not yet happened for this year. So we don't yet know what grant funds will be available for fiscal year 24. Right now, we are under a continuing resolution and don't know yet what the funding, the final funding amount will be.
Melanie, may I ask, does the program recommend the level of funding that it will need in the upcoming fiscal year? And if so, because some of the information that the subcommittee has been acquiring from museums and agencies in terms of costs indicates a much higher level of need. And so how do we, now that we're seeing the hard numbers, how are we going to respond with respect to that higher need for museums to comply? Because we're moving in the right direction. We just need to get funding that they need to continue consultation and expedite repatriation.
Certainly, and I think that is best addressed by the committee in its report to Congress. As Congress is responsible for those appropriations, that is the best way for you to direct that information.
Question with regard to notice processing time. It's been my experience that has improved significantly. Is that I don't know, is that the continued trend throughout this past fiscal year? In terms of processing time?
Yes, it is due, and again, we think in large part to the template has made it easier for us to do those reviews. A large change in the template was to only have the list of Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations once. So we only have to check the names once. That is a big task that we have to do, and that's a big reduction. I will say that the other real improvement has actually been Lori Jennings' dedication to achieving a certain number of review each week and really setting herself to that task. And I would say it's been a personal objective of Lori's and a dedication of hers, and I really think she has the credit really goes to Lori, I should say, as much as anything. And we've all worked to support her and try to assist with the review as much as we can. But really, it's just been an effort on her part to push through as many as we could.
Well, our heartfelt gratitude to Lori and the staff for doing so. Mahalo.
This is Tim. Sorry you can't see me because my camera's not working. In turn, I appreciate the question on processing time, and I know that your staff is working really hard to get these done. But I also know that the amount of time that you work on them is not the total amount of time from receipt to publication. There's also another process after you've approved it and until it gets to the Federal Register. Has there been any effort to sort of streamline that process any? Because I know that can take some time.
That process right now is pretty streamlined, and actually it is also publicly available or transparent. I sign a notice and it's dated the date that I sign it. And you can see that that's different than the date that it publishes in the Federal Register. Typically, the difference between the date that I sign it and the date that it publishes is somewhere between 4 or 5 days.
That's excellent. Thank you.
Depending on weekends. But but you can see weekends and sometimes vacations, and occasionally I don't sign them as quickly as Lori tells me to. So that's sometimes on me. But my signature date is when I sign it, and then it publishes. That's the only other review period you can find and calculate that date.
So do notices still have to be reviewed by exec sec?
Anything that gets published in the Federal Register within the Department of the Interior has to go through a review process within the Department of the Interior.
And that happens after your signature?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
at first, Melanie, your report, a very good report. And the objectives and the accomplishments, and you cited some accomplishments that exceeded past years. And you and your people there, or at least need to be commended. Because things now are beginning to show not only better communication, but it's enabling more accomplishments. And this is a good thing. And it can only get better, Melanie. And it will get better. But I truly appreciate, the people that you work with, the ones that we don't see, the ones that we don't hear about. But the ones in the background need to be applauded. Because it's a big engine. You're the captain, Melanie. You got a good crew. And because of that crew, all these accomplishments that you cited are very good. And us as a committee, it's only better for the work that we do. And again, Melanie and Lise and crew, thank you for all your wonderful work, the hard work that you do. So a question, Melanie, during the report, the report to Congress, what's the status with that report?
Yes, with your report to Congress. The committee has not finalized its report yet. That is something you will be discussing today.
Okay. So, asking the committee, let's move forward, let's approve it. Thank you.
And Armand, I want to thank you for that statement. I appreciate it. I want to say that I know the staff appreciates hearing those words from you as well. It is very meaningful to them to know that their work is recognized. I think that they are all happy that I'm the captain and they're not sitting here in this seat. But they also really very much appreciate the recognition and the acknowledgement of how much they contribute to this work. So thank you.
And again,
I echo that support as well.
finally, Melanie, it only comes to light that there's no item G. Thank you.
Further questions? So Melanie, you said we can expect the APR sometime this month, but prior to our November 30th meeting.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, any idea? Because we're still, that was one reason why we're still working on our draft report, is because we were requesting the civil penalties information, so that the initial draft, which was at the subcommittee, could be shared with Armin and Toby, who aren't on that committee, before we issued it publicly. But we went ahead and did that pending receipt of that civil penalties information.
Yes, again, as I'm working to get it done as quickly as I can, juggling a lot of other priorities, as I'm sure you're aware, and also want to be sure that we adequately recognize in the annual report all of the successful efforts from this year. So it is taking me a little longer than I expected to be able to finalize that report. But again, I can't give you any firmer date than I will have it to you before the end of before the 29th, although I would say, I would hope to have it to you before the Thanksgiving holiday would be my ultimate goal here.
Thank you. I wanted to take the time to acknowledge the work of the subcommittee on the report to Congress. The drafts that we've been reviewing, which was continually being updated as information was coming in. Just the amount of effort and thought that went into the reviews of those drafts. I'm just sorry that we weren't able to share it with the full committee before we issued it. So Ivan would have seen it before it went out today. But we will, it also needs to be said that there is a very voluminous amount of information that we're presented with, that we're reviewing and processing to be able to highlight in our report to Congress. So that's impacting our ability to get the report out. I just want to acknowledge the review committee members who've been working very hard on doing so. So are there any further questions for Melanie on the annual program report?
Okay, if not, we can move on to the next agenda item. The next item on the agenda is a presentation from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service. If you'll give me just a minute, I will be sure that the presenter is ready to present. Leslie?
Yes, good morning. Thank you. A little bit of a cold this morning, but thank you very much. And I'm glad that Zoom worked to bring me on. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Leslie Schmidt. Good morning. And I am the new Forest Service NAGPRA coordinator based out of the National Headquarters Office of the Forest Service. I have over 20 years of experience in cultural resource management and a master's degree in biological anthropology. I've worked as an archaeologist for the Forest Service for the past 17 years, and I started my current position last spring. I am extremely pleased to report that the NAGPRA coordinator position for the Forest Service was converted from a collateral one with other duties to a full-time position on the National Heritage Team. Our previous NAGPRA coordinator, Wendy Sutton, is still active as the Region 3 Heritage Program Leader, and she's been available to help get me up to speed and answer questions as I go. So today, I would like to provide a brief overview of the Forest Service Heritage Program and discuss our progress made with NAGPRA compliance and our plans moving forward. Within the Forest Service Heritage Program, there is a National Heritage Team based in Washington, D.C. at the Forest Service headquarters, although this team works virtually across the nation. I myself am in Northern California. This team is led by our agency Heritage Program Leader and Assistant Heritage Program Leader, and has recently expanded to include my position, 2 program specialists, and a national database manager. In addition to this team, there are regional heritage program leaders in each of the 9 regions in the National Forest System. The headquarters and regional leaders collaborate as a national heritage team. These leaders oversee and provide guidance to the individual forests within each region. Each forest has a heritage program manager and heritage professionals at the district levels. NAGPRA is most often implemented at the forest and district levels since the heritage professionals in the field have the closest relationships with tribes local to their areas. To assist them through the regulatory process as needed, the NAGPRA coordinator provides guidance, advice, and templates to the field, receives funding requests, tracks progress made, and reports data to the National NAGPRA program. A little bit about Forest Service collections. They have been historically located at non-federal museums and curation facilities, with small collections sometimes housed on individual Forest Service units. Ongoing work with off-forest collections continues to reveal previously unknown human remains and cultural items subject to NAGPRA, and we publish new notices of inventory completion and update summaries as these are identified. Faunal collections have been and continue to be under careful analysis by osteologists to identify potential ancestors within those collections. Museum capacity to look at faunal collections for the identification of ancestral remains and the discovery of these in faunal collections continues to slow the completion of repatriation in our agency as well as others. In terms of our collection progress since NAGPRA was enacted, the Forest Service has provided summaries or statements of no summary for all Forest Service units. We have published approximately 108 notices of inventory completion, including 15 revised or corrected notices and 41 notices of intent to repatriate. We continue to update notices and publish new notices as new findings are discovered in existing collections. Overall, we have identified 5,566 sets of human remains in collections. That's the minimum number of individuals, or MNI, of which 2,295 ancestors have been repatriated. 747 have not been culturally affiliated and are listed as such with National NAGPRA. Along with the ancestors, approximately 2,200 associated funerary objects have been returned, which represents about half of the associated funerary objects identified in Forest Service collections. The Forest Service has been even more successful in repatriating unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. Over 7,000 items have been repatriated in these categories, which represents 93% of items identified as such since NAGPRA was enacted. Progress in collections work is happening at many local units across the agency. As an example, within the past year, a funding agreement was executed between the Tonto National Forest and Arizona State University. The University Museum holds large collections from the Tonto, and they are currently undergoing a phased approach for identification of ancestors and funerary items in those collections. So far, over 1,400 ancestors have been reported in these collections. Looking into the future, we anticipate publication of the new regulations into adjusting our compliance strategy to conform with them. Our continued engagement with tribes will be at the forefront as we proceed with this important work. I would also like to develop training for the regions and forests about how regulatory compliance with the anticipated new rule and how that differs from our understanding of NAGPRA compliance in the past. I'll be exploring the creation of a strategic plan for Forest Service collections with NAGPRA ancestors and items and the integration of this data into our already confidential heritage and cultural resources database. This will certainly aid incoming heritage professionals that may need to pick up incomplete NAGPRA work and continue the process. Thank you for the opportunity to present this update. Are there any questions?
Members?
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Armin, go ahead.
thank you, Leslie, for your report. During your report, Leslie, you cited two numbers. One was 5,600, I believe, sets of human remains.
Mm-hmm.
And then also the second number you cited was 4,000. So again, Leslie, can you cite more information with those two numbers?
So the more than 5,000 sets of human remains and collections have been identified in inventories, and 2,295 of those ancestors have been repatriated. So that's the little bit of discrepancy.
And then the second number you cited was about 4,000.
I'm sorry if I don't have 4,000 in my data. 2,200 associated funerary objects. And then perhaps I gave too many numbers, but
Can you
there
go over
are,
them again, please?
pardon me?
Can you go over the numbers again?
Oh, sure,
Too many
yes,
questions.
yes, absolutely. Okay, so the numbers again are that we have identified 5,566 sets of human remains or ancestors, and 2,295 of those have been repatriated. 747 have not yet been culturally affiliated.
Okay, and then the last question, Leslie. So during your report, too, you cited holdings,
Mhm.
what the Forest Service has.
Mhm.
So I guess part of the question, Leslie, is how many holdings are there? And within those holdings, have the funerary objects associated or unassociated, including human remains, identified or unidentifiable, are there numbers that go with those holdings?
So I don't have numbers with me about the number of collections the Forest Service has across the agency. What I can tell you is that many of our numbers come from initial inventories from the beginning days of NAGPRA, and that we know that in those beginning days, our numbers were sometimes off because of the speed of the work that was happening. Sometimes human remains, especially very small pieces, were misidentified as faunal and put into faunal collections. So now that we know this and that we have learned this over time, we are going back to those faunal collections that have previously had ancestors reported in them so that we can ensure that all of the ancestors are removed from those collections and repatriated. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, and to follow up, Leslie,
Mhm.
the Forest Service know how many collections there are?
I could check on those numbers. I think that sometimes we find new collections. The museums alert us to collections that maybe we didn't know we have in their holdings, just through the nature of having, these reports or collection agreements get lost over time. So I can see if I can get those numbers for you.
Okay, it's a bit concerning, Leslie, what you just said. Find,
Mhm.
you mentioned find. So the Forest Service made find. That's a bit concerning, Leslie.
I hear you. I think that what I mean to say is that we can't know if there were collections put on a box and the paperwork misfiled in the past. But what we can do is when we're notified that there are collections or that there could be NAGPRA items or ancestors in these collections, which is new information to us today. And when we're notified of that, that's when we can really get into it and ensure that we're looking closely and identifying all those ancestors and items.
Okay, and then last question, Leslie. Does the Forest Service have holdings or collections at UC Berkeley, Peabody Museum, Harvard, Illinois State Museum, Indiana University, or Ohio History Connection?
If I could get that list of museums from you, I will check up on that.
Melanie, can you help with that?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I'll send you the list, Leslie.
Thank you.
And just to cite, Leslie, when we had our meeting in Bloomington,
Mhm.
it was glaringly brought to our attention as a committee that these 5 entities have very, very large collections of
Mhm.
human remains that are unidentifiable. That is a very big concern.
Mhm.
That universities like these places of education can have such large ancestral remains that are unidentified. That's a
Mhm.
big concern. And if the Forest Service had collections with these universities, we need to know that.
Yes, I hear you. And I think that part of my role as the full-time NAGPRA coordinator will be to gather all of this data together and create a plan for how to address it. So I hear your concern. I am also concerned, and I will be more than happy to check into this.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Melanie.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, yes, Dr. McEwen, go ahead.
I just want to thank Ms. Schmidt very, very much for providing detailed and comprehensive cost estimates to us. They are greatly appreciated. They're very useful to us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
If I may, Leslie, just back to the numbers again.
Sure.
To clarify, you said 5,566 individuals were identified,
I did, yes.
and then the number of repatriated was 2,295,
Yes, correct.
and then the number of not culturally affiliated was 747.
Yes.
So the status of the remaining 2,524 remains?
So those would be the ones that are in inventories but have not yet been repatriated. And that would be something to follow up with into the future as well, of course.
Could you further elaborate on that? Inventories are not yet repatriated. Are they just in the
Mhm.
process of consultation? They're going through the NAGPRA process?
Well, they could, many could be. And also as we know, in the early days of NAGPRA, when these inventories were created, they weren't all claimed. So some of them are older inventories that have not had a request for repatriation yet. And those would be some inventories to look at again and to track down and notify tribes again, because I'm sure back in the early days, the capacity issues on both tribes and agencies prevented, every last inventory of being followed through with. But I look forward to getting a handle on that and, kicking off that notification again. Mhm.
That's really what I was, I guess, leading to is
Mhm.
has the Forest Service contacted tribes to inform them that they have these collections and that the consultation process can proceed, because it seemed like there was a little less than half of the remains have not been, are not actively being repatriated.
Right, and many times it is the individual forests that would be contacting the tribes, the local tribes, and some of the forests would have contacted tribes, would have said, hey, we have this inventory, and I don't know if you remember about it, because again, with all of our collective memories and the long span of time since the inventories were created. But then there are forests that maybe have had turnover in their personnel since the inventories were created, and they may not know either. So I think it's just that issue of the long period of time and the individual capacities of both tribes and forests that have resulted in that large number. That is different.
Can we urge the individual
Yes.
services to
Oh, yes, yes.
actively expedite? It's the I guess the trend to actively contact tribes and initiate the arduous consultation process.
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, this position was a collateral duty with another position for a very long time. So the capacity issue, even at that level, was real. Now that I'm in the position with this being my full-time job, I definitely plan to track this down and assist.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Members, questions?
Mr. Hi, Leslie. I had some questions about some of the numbers that you
Sure.
provided about
Mhm.
your future projected expenditures. Can you give us a little bit more information about how you arrived at those figures?
Sure. Now, are you referring to the estimates in the meeting materials?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. One moment while I pull that up really quick. And your question is how we arrived at the previous expenditures or at the estimates?
At the estimates. moving
Okay,
forward.
so estimates moving forward. And again, I'm having a little bit of trouble finding it just because I'm live. But as far as the expenditures moving forward, we were looking at how we have done repatriation in the past and applying a very broad cost estimate to doing that exact same thing. With that said, I realize that the new regulations may change how we go through the process and how we conduct the repatriation. And I would hesitate to change that estimate until they are published, but I anticipate that it would change too. So it was based on how we have previously conducted the repatriation without knowing what the final rule will be.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Aaron?
um. You know, throughout this process, Leslie, communication never ends. And it has to continue. And communication not only helps clarify, but it also helps discussion on how objectives and goals can be worked and accomplished. Communication is key. But one of those keys to enable communication is a current consultation policy. And that's the question, does the Forest Service have a current consultation policy?
A consultation policy per NAGPRA?
For tribes?
Well, I can tell you that across the agency, and again, this would vary based on the individual relationships at each district and at each forest, but we consult with tribes. Having worked for the agency for a very long time, we consult with tribes constantly. Management of the lands, the projects that we would like to propose, all of it. Tribes are increasingly more involved in these discussions and decisions.
So again, Leslie, does the Forest Service have a current consultation policy?
We do have directives through our Office of Tribal Relations, and within our Forest Service manual and handbook, we do have some policy, yes.
Okay. As a note, Leslie, here in the Northwest, there is a problem
Okay.
with consultation. And as tribes know, consultation isn't a phone call, letter. Consultation is when me and you could sit down at the same table. That's what consultation is. So you cite Forest Service and their districts, etc. The consultation, Leslie, has to be implemented with everyone.
I agree.
And consultation here in the Northwest with the Forest Service is a problem. So I'll bring that to your attention.
Thank you. Yes. And as you know, relationships and open communication isn't necessarily something that can be directed through policy. So it how consultation is done is going to vary, but I will certainly bring that forward to my agency leaders that it is a problem in the Northwest,
Thank you.
of course.
Further questions?
Mr. Chair,
Yes,
Uh,
Jen.
Leslie, thank you very much for your report. Really appreciate you speaking to us today. I want to make sure I'm very clear on this. The Forest Service, unlike the National Park Service, does not have repositories for your collections. Your collections are in other institutions like
Correct.
museums and at universities and so on. Is that correct?
That is mostly correct. There are some locations that have smaller collections housed at the local units, but for the most part, collections are in larger university museums or other museums, yes.
So, so in terms of your consultation process, it's also a matter of working with the museums and the museum staff and
Mhm.
coordinating these consultations. Is that correct?
Yes, I would say for access, as long as museums have capacity to grant that access and work on the collections work. Yes,
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
thank you.
Any additional questions for Leslie?
If I might, Mr. Chair, this is Tim.
Yes, sir.
Um, I really appreciate you appearing and providing all this information, Ms. Schmidt. I know as a long-serving Fed that sometimes it's hard to get your higher administrators' attention on these kinds of issues. But one thing that I'd like to draw your attention to is that in the meeting materials, under presentations, there are 3 documents, one of them from the Chief of Staff of the Secretary of the Interior, one of them or 2 of them from the Assistant Secretary for Policy Management and Budget, that directs all DOI bureaus to complete notices of inventory completion for the remains in DOI control by the end of April of next year. So that might be something your administrators might be interested in seeing.
Further comments?
Just one more question for me. Do you have a projected timeline on how long it might take you to get a better understanding of how many collections and how many facilities you have housed across the United States?
I don't necessarily have a timeline for that. Being a little new in this position, I'm a little unsure of exactly how that data might be kept and how hard it might be to compile it. So that could just be my, newness at the position, or it could be something larger. So I can report back on what I find.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As a follow-up, do you, can you comment on what's been done, what efforts were undertaken? These requirements were passed in 1990.
Mhm.
One would hope that we have the agencies and museums have had more than adequate time to acquire the necessary resources to at least do the identification process.
Mhm.
Any comment on what happened in the prior years to get to this point?
As far as the number of collections or the number of collections that may have NAGPRA ancestors or items in them?
The latter.
The latter, okay. I think that what is probably happening is, as I mentioned previously, many times when items or ancestors were identified, that perhaps they weren't all identified in the collections, and we wouldn't have known that at the time. It's something that's come to light and has had us reassess some of those collections again to look for things that might have been missed the first time around.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Members, any further questions for Ms. Schmidt?
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Simon, go ahead.
Melanie, if you can help me here, just to start that, Leslie is going to report back to us on the number of collections and holdings. And also, the 5 institutes that were cited, if the Forest Service has holdings within those 5 institutes. I think maybe that's it, Melanie. I'm not sure on what other things Leslie may report back to us.
Certainly, we will, we'll go over the transcript and send a list to Leslie of information that you requested she submit to you.
Okay. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you very much.
Last chance for questions. Having heard none, back to you, Melanie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Appreciate
Great.
the information.
Yes, thank you,
Very
Leslie.
much. Thank you.
Hey, moving ahead, Mr. Chair, the next item on the agenda is your report to Congress. Before we jump into that, would you like to take a break? We've
Yes,
been
please.
with this, okay, for an hour. How long of a break would you like to take?
Is 10 minutes okay?
That's fine with me. This will also give people in the audience a chance to see the draft that was posted to the meeting materials just ahead of the meeting today. I will add a link in the meeting chat. And when we resume, we can begin the discussion of your draft report to Congress.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we will take a break for 10 minutes.
All right.
Hey, if you could all please return. Time is up. The next item on the agenda is a discussion of the report to Congress for fiscal year 2023. The updated draft report to Congress was included in the meeting materials just before the meeting. I will turn the discussion of the report to Congress over to the committee.
Yes, thank you. Is Toby back? Do we know? Okay, let's proceed. I've asked Dr. McEwen if he could, as the subcommittee lead, if he could lead a discussion on our current draft of the FY 2023 report to Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Given that 5 of us on the subcommittee are overly familiar with this draft and that Toby and Armand are not, I'd recommend we sort of wait a minute until they get back, because they're the ones I think that we need to make sure are, because they've not seen it before. Is that fair?
Yes, and just by way of background and the discussion leading up to the agenda for this meeting, I initially asked, because of the volume of information we were dealing with, and that we were still at the subcommittee level in terms of preparing the report to Congress, that we hold off on that until the November 30th meeting. But we decided, at the urging of the Park Service to proceed and with that discussion. But as a result of that, the report was just what we were not able to get that current draft to the rest of the committee, which is Armin and Toby, hence Tim's comment. Armin, what's Toby's status?
Say again,
Where's Toby? We're waiting for him to continue the discussion since we're familiar with the current draft, the subcommittee members, but you two aren't. Wanted to make
we had to step away for a bit. He said he would be right back. So, we can wait or we can keep going ahead.
Well, being that the meeting is recorded, I recommend that we proceed and then he can review those sections of the discussion that he missed. Is everyone comfortable with that? Okay. Tim, if you could proceed.
Okay. Since the 5 of us are very familiar with the document and you're not, Armin, because this is the first you've seen it, how would you like to proceed in reviewing the document? I mean, we can read it word for word. We can do whatever you're comfortable with. Armin?
Well, Tim, Mr. Chair,
Yes, Armin.
maybe Tim, it would be, I guess, worthwhile to know what changes have been made to the current report.
I can do that, sure.
I don't know if that's large or small, but if there's changes, maybe that would be a starting point.
Okay, fair enough. Let me start then by saying that we had at the Bloomington meeting, we had requested a number of different types of information from various parties to sort of help us with this process. And in the meeting materials, there's a number of documents that are posted there, one under Report to Congress FY 2023 folder, RC requests for invited institutions. And we got written responses from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, from the Forest Service, from Indiana University, from the Field Museum, from the Bureau of Reclamation, from the University of Missouri, and from the Army Corps of Engineers. So those materials are all there. And we had looked through those as we were doing this draft, revised draft. We had also asked at Bloomington for copies of the responses that 5 institutions had sent at the request of the Senate Committee of Indian Affairs. And those documents are also there from the University of California, Berkeley. I'm just going down the list here. From Ohio Historical Connection, from Indiana University, from Illinois State Museum, and from Harvard. So those materials are all there as well.
In Berkeley.
And Berkeley, sorry. And those are all very interesting data sets, I think, for us, very useful data sets. And there was one piece that actually will not be addressed until next meeting, a presentation, but the documents were posted, and at least one of the documents occurred before the end of the fiscal year. And that's the announcement by the department of this deadline in terms of all DOI bureaus completing notices of inventory completion. So I think we sort of figured that that was fair game for us, since part of it at least happened before the end of the year. So we've put that in there as well. So turning to the document itself, as I indicated at our last meeting, I took a first crack at doing a revised draft. I started with the one that we did for FY 2022. So there's a lot of the sections here that are pretty close to identical or with some small changes. The executive summary with a couple of small tinkerings to the numbering later on is pretty much identical to what we did last time. The summary of activities, the review committee members, we changed those and put the appropriate appointment or end of their appointment dates. The review committee meetings, I tried to do a summary of what happened at each of the meetings. I used both the summary of the meeting as well as the transcripts to get that detail. Progress made. This is pretty much starting from scratch, and it was based on largely on the materials that the museums and tribes gave us at the meetings, plus a review of the transcript. So I think let's start there in terms of new text. So for progress made, the first one was publication of the proposed revision of the regulations implementing NAGPRA on October 18th, 2022. I indicated that there was a 90-day comment period that was later extended to January 31st, and that there were 181 public comments, and that the review committee commented on January the 10th of 2023, pages of comments. Any questions on that? Hearing none. Number 2, cooperation, collaboration with tribes, museums carrying out NAGPRA implementation. I largely focus these on the presentations that we received from Indiana University Vassar, Colorado Springs Fine Arts, Detroit Institute of Art, the Witt Museum. All of those were in collaboration and co-presented by tribal representatives. So I figured that that was a good evidence that we personally had seen of cooperation and collaboration. Number 3, we put in a section here on the press coverage, which I think has been phenomenal in the last year, largely driven by the efforts of ProPublica. to come up with a very user-friendly database of the same data that the Park Service provides. So it's very accurate. I think it's got some bells and whistles on the presentation that are very useful. And secondly, there was another series that was run by the Washington Post that specifically focused on the Smithsonian, which I think is of interest to us. This was a late addition, and it relates to those documents that appeared in our meeting materials for the presentation that will actually happen at the end of the month. But it's about the Department of the Interior establishing administrative deadlines for all bureaus to complete notice of inventory completion by April the 20th, unless additional time is requested by Indian tribes. And I think that's pretty significant. Number 5 was I think last year we had talked about the impending consideration of the Safeguard Tribal Objects of Patrimony Act. In December, that act was actually passed. So I put the information in there. And just as a reminder, this review committee is mentioned in that statute as having a sort of advisory role if asked. So I put that in as a good thing. And lastly, number 6 was introduction of another bill dealing with federal Indian boarding schools that we had commented on the general effort that the Secretariat initially started, but now this has resulted in introduction of legislation. Questions on the progress made? Does that sound reasonable, Armin?
Reasonable.
Okay. Then we got to the barriers to overcome. A lot of these sections I think we had had in the earlier ones. I changed some of the language around a little bit or added stuff. Continued resistance of some institutions. The Miami tribe had identified some. There were a number of other tribes that had mentioned things to us. That there were 13 allegations of failure to comply that the Park Service reported to have received this year. That I think we have heard that there are some states that insist on relying solely on state burial law regarding disposition of Native American human remains when NAGPRA also applies. And then we highlighted this issue of the Army War College at Carlisle, where the Army insists on not complying with NAGPRA for the intentional excavation of Native American human remains on Army land as a barrier. Sometime near the end of the year, there was the Government Accountability Office issued, I think, what they call a SNAP report, which is sort of an update of all the things they've previously done. And one of the things that they included in there is that they've made 55 recommendations to federal agencies to improve implementation of NAGPRA in a variety of different reports. And they indicated that there were, I think it's can't remember how many it is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I think they indicated that there were 9 recommendations that at that point had not been addressed by the agencies, and they didn't specify what they were. So I called them and they told me what they were. And this text is actually pretty close to what the actual recommendations are that GAO included in their report, but have not been addressed. There was one that I did not include, and that was about one agency and how they deal with, in Alaska, with Alaska Native corporations. And I think that that's an issue that GAO has already addressed on NAGPRA. Initially, the regulations included Alaska Native corporations as having standing to make claims, and GAO looked at that and found that there was no basis in that in the statute, so that was removed. So I didn't think we needed to raise that issue again. But all of these other ones are from the GAO report. Conflicting estimates of cost of repatriation. We had raised that last year because the department in proposing in the proposed rule had indicated a certain amount, but that we were hearing from other sources that it was much, much more than that. And that's why we asked for the additional information. So when we get to the later part of the report, I've included some of that information that we've received about what the amount of money is. Sensitive information currently unprotected. This, I think, is pretty close to what we had put in last time. Staff support. I think this is from the last report as well. And Native Hawaiian organizations, there was this is a new section that dovetails with some recommendations we made last time. But I had heard from readers of the report that they thought it should be identified as a barrier. So I asked Kalaeloa to come up with some text to put in this spot. Question on the barriers. Onward to recommendations. Many of these are very similar to ones that we did last time. Shifting the definition of sacred object or modifying it to include traditional Native religion or family spiritual practices as an additional piece of text there. Revising the definition of Native American to mean of or related to a tribe, people, or culture that is or was indigenous to any geographical area that is now located within the boundaries of the United States. That relates to a court case that I believe Armin and Toby are very familiar with. Hui Malama in C. That was basically, since Hui Malama is no longer in existence, but now has an organization that is sort of heir to that. It's basically to take Hui Malama out of the statutory text and to replace it with Hui Iwi Kuamo'o. Sorry if I butchered that, Eddie. There was a change to the sort of to implement that in terms of the definition of Native Hawaiian organization, which would remove Hui Malami na Kupuna o Hawaiine and include Hui Imi Ku'omo, and to also include a piece of a provision that says it does not include any museum or agency or subdivision of the state of Hawaii or the United States. And this has to do with historical things that have happened. I'll just leave it at that. Right of possession. This is an issue to sort of clarify it, how it applies to unassociated funerary objects. This is from the last one as well. The ownership section, number 2. One was an amendment to the definition of how Aboriginal land is determined. And the current one says that it needs to be based on a final judgment of the Indian Claims Commission or the United States Court of Claims as Aboriginal land of an Indian tribe. And we had recommended last time that also include treaties, acts of Congress, and executive orders to bring it in line with what this committee has recommended in the past on disposition of culturally unidentifiable remains. And I think this would obviate the need for the sort of proposed regulation text between adjudicated Aboriginal land and acknowledged Aboriginal land. I think those are the terms that are in there. It would just make them both the same, which I think would be useful. We had asked last time for the Government Accountability Office to complete an evaluation of federal agency compliance with the excavation and discovery provisions of the statute. And there were a number of different things that we had mentioned there that were of concern to us. Under repatriation of federal agency and museum collections, one of the provisions, and it's sort of a under the current statute and the regular, or under the statute, the museums were required to determine the culturally affiliated human remains and associated funerary objects, and to come up with a list of culturally unidentifiable human remains, and that would be referred to the review committee for recommendation of what that disposition would be. And back in 2010, we did that, or no, 2000 actually. I think the review committee did that, made a recommendation that became the basis of regulatory provisions in 10.11, section 10.11. But one of the odd things about the statute is it authorizes or directs the review committee to make recommendations on the disposition of culturally unidentifiable human remains, but it doesn't direct the committee to make that recommendation for associated funerary objects, which I think all of us would agree those should go together, but that's not what Congress said. So to go that extra step is contrary to what they said to us. So I think it would be useful to go back and to change the statute to address that issue once and for all. Civil penalties. This is the part where we had asked for additional information, which hopefully will be forthcoming. But as it stands, we had used, this is based on the data that was included in last year's report, which was from the program report for 2022. Grants funding. This basically was looking at the whole issue of what's this really going to cost, and the confusion over the department coming up with estimates of the cost, which seemed to be much lower than what we were hearing from museums. And last year we had asked the Government Accountability Office to basically look into it, to come up with real numbers that everybody would agree on. There's a chart in there that sort of shows how grants funding has been distributed over the last 29 years, I guess. And then after that, on the next page, these are all bullet points from museums or federal agencies that gave us real numbers of what it's costing them to implement, which are some pretty large numbers. There's also an issue here that some tribes have indicated that museums may be using grant funding for things that are outside of the purview of the statute. So that's another thing that I think we would want the GAO to look at. So we would ask for a comprehensive evaluation of the grants program and to compile data from tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, museums, and federal agencies to get a realistic estimate of the actual costs. Native Hawaiian traditional religious leaders. The statute in terms of membership says that 3 of the members shall be appointed by the secretary from nominations submitted by Indian tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, and traditional Native American religious leaders, with at least 2 of such persons being traditional Indian religious leaders. Historically, back in the day, that was generally interpreted to mean both Native Hawaiian and Indian tribe religious leaders. My understanding is that more recently, that is not the way it's been interpreted. So this would try to fix that so that Native Hawaiian religious leaders could be nominated to those positions. Trafficking. I updated the chart that we had last year to include information from the executive offices of, of U.S. attorneys that looks at all of the convictions and all of the declinations over time. There's 127 cases that have been considered over that period. And as a solution to sort of help deal with that, we recommended that and this also ties into the whole passage of the STOP Act, which is related to this as well, that we'd recommended that Congress appropriate the $3 million that was included in the Congressional Budget Office recommendation and evaluation for the STOP Act, that they revise the definition of Native American, which has an implication, a chilling effect on prosecution of these cases. We had proposed an amendment that basically would remove the B part of the statute that requires that the government show beyond a reasonable doubt that the object was obtained in violation of the statute, and instead add other cultural objects to the first part that basically ties it only to were obtained without right of possession. So it would make it simpler, broader, easier to prove. And then fourth, last year we had asked for additional appropriation for establishment of, back in the day, it was called the ARPA task force, but a interagency task force to focus on these issues. And we've included that here as well. But the second piece was new, which was recommended to me by an assistant U.S. attorney, was to actually have an office in the main Justice Department. And that would probably be in the environmental crimes section, that would have jurisdiction at the Washington level to coordinate these things. Right now, most of these cases are being picked up by U.S. attorneys out in their various jurisdictions with very little coordination amongst them. So having an oversight organization, I think, would be a good addition to help with this. And then the other piece to that is one of the GAO recommendations that was not dealt with was they had asked the Park Service and the BIA to sort of provide information to the departmental consulting archaeologist on violations of ARPA, NAGPRA, the Antiquities Act, and those had not been addressed. So in thinking about this, the idea was that instead of forcing the DCA to do this, which apparently there's not much interest in doing that, in responding to GAO on that, that basically they would set up a new office or have this go with a DOJ office that would require submission that information to DOJ and would help them coordinate these activities. 8, exemption from disclosure of culturally sensitive information. This was from last time. I think we're all concerned about the various types of information that can be obtained and how to protect that. We had talked last time about administrative placement of NAGPRA implementation to the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs Office, and that's largely the same text of what we did last time. On NMAI Act, I think last time we had recommended inclusion of in the statute of a cause of action that would allow a tribe or other party that was unhappy with the way the Smithsonian had dealt with a repatriation case. It would provide them access to federal district court. And we had put that in last time, particularly in discussing this issue with a number of people that were involved in the Washington Post story on the Smithsonian. I pulled down their statute and basically tried to make their repatriation requirements as close to NAGPRA as I could. So it would require notices, there would be deadlines for them to determine cultural affiliation, which are not in their statute as it stands. Report to Congress. I think there was a discussion last time about whether making recommendations on the Smithsonian or other on excavations and discoveries were within our jurisdiction. And so we had recommended that Congress amend the statute to make it absolutely clear that it's part of our jurisdiction. And then the last one was on reburials on national parks and other federally owned land. And there's a set of provisions that would basically amend statutes to authorize reburial on those lands. Going to the second part, which is sort of the statistical, or the program statistics, Melanie was very helpful in providing with that. I think we had some issues about some of the language in the second block there that sort of implied that things had actually been repatriated when we didn't know that for a fact. So I've changed that language here to just say completed the NAGPRA process, leaving it at that. And one thing that I noticed, Melanie, in looking at the document you sent us, the number in the first block for more NAGPRA work needed, there was a different number there. I went and looked at Tableau, and this 102,708 seems to be the number in Tableau. I'm not quite sure where the other number came from, but that's something that I'd appreciate if you'd look at. The rest of it I didn't touch. Questions, Armin? Toby?
Thank you, Tim. But at first, Tim, it would be great if this report can be finalized. But it's very clear, Tim, that there are institutes and agencies, museums, and universities that are totally and blatantly ignoring the Government Accountability Office recommendation. And that's a problem. It would be a suggestion, Kim, that this report highlight for the GAO, highlight for the National Park Service, highlight for Department of Interior, museums, and universities. They need to pay attention to this report. But also, Tim, now we have allies that are in DC. And we need to, again, identify a champion to help us. And, you know, this report too, there's the Native American Caucus. They need to become aware, but also educated, so that they can help us. But overall, you know, this is a good report. And again, you know, there are some glaring, flat out blatant non-compliance with NAGPRA. And Melanie's office has received numerous complaints. And she'll continue to get numerous complaints. And these complaints not only slow down repatriation, it slows down working with repatriation. And the bottom line thing is that tribes can't get back their ancestors. So, you know, the head of National Park Service, the head of Interior, you know, Secretary Allen, specifically these two individuals, if they become aware and they're given the right information, they can make other people aware. This is what I know. And a lot of times that's all it takes. So just these comments, Tim, again, the GAO, Park Service, Interior, museums, and universities, even federal agencies that are flat out ignoring NAGPRA. So just those comments, Tim.
For me, I just had one comment about that, about the NAGPRA implementation responsibility. It's almost like a I believe it's Article 6 for June 9th, 1855 treaty. Supreme law of the land, and it stands next to trust responsibility for our government and being able to work with the tribes and being able to keep up on their end that trust responsibility, you know, is other than that, that's all I have. Thank you.
I have a follow-up comment to that, actually. It's found in the accompanying memorandum from Harvard University, from the Peabody. It's on page 2. And I was hoping, you know, Melanie, if you could give us some background and clarification on this. The writer is referring to, it says, through historic treaties, maps, and royal charters to determine which are authoritative government documents that can properly identify tribal lands under the Act. It's a complicated task for Peabody staff and tribal nations alike. National NAGPRA briefly maintained but recently removed an online resource listing authoritative government documents that could be relied on in making decisions to associate and return ancestors and cultural items. This type of resource helped all institutions implement the regulatory emphasis on historical geographical territories that often require consultations with multiple tribal nations. Could you give us some background on that and whether there's any chance that information can be made available again to help support the consultation and ultimately the repatriation process?
Sure, I can give you background on the resources that used to be available on the National NAGPRA program website. There were a series of tables in Word that were produced by the National NAGPRA program that were related to Royce maps, maps that were produced in 1890 by Charles C. Royce as a part of the Bureau of Ethnography at the Smithsonian. There are a number of issues related to that data set. There are issues with the Royce maps themselves, produced in 1890. There were issues with the word tables that were produced by the National NAGPRA program. And there were issues with a lot of things. We engaged in an effort to try to resolve some of those issues. And we were unable to do so in a effective or efficient manner. And rather than put any more resources, time, or effort into solving what amounted to be potentially damaging information, I made the decision to remove those tables from our website in favor of actually encouraging museums to, first of all, consult with tribes about their treaties, which I felt was a better resource than really a tertiary source, if you think about it. The Royce tables is being a secondary source, the treaty itself being the primary source. The word table produced by the NAGPRA program is the tertiary source, if you put it in that perspective. Really a consultation with tribes about their treaties and their engagement with the US government is the best place to get that information. But in addition to that, there are plenty of other sources for museums to require information about treaties between the US government and tribes. Certainly, there are a number of historians, a lot of them at Harvard, that have spent their careers studying treaties between the United States and Indian tribes. I don't think that word tables on the National Park Service NAGPRA website was the best source of that information. So those were my reasons for removing that information. Since then, I will say that there have been renewed efforts in producing additional resources related to treaties. Those have come from a lot of different sources. The National Archives engaged in an effort to digitize original treaty text over the last several years. In addition to that, the US Department of Agriculture, along with the Department of the Interior, has been engaged in an effort just over the last year with the University of Oklahoma related to Kapler's version of the treaties, Charles Kapler's version of the treaties. You can find links to all of that on our website. So there's resources there. Again, there's plenty of resources out there. Ours was not the only one, certainly, and it certainly was not the best.
Thank you for that. I was just concerned that that may have been like an administrative cost-cutting measure for.
No, it was a potentially a bad data measure.
Thank you for that. I think Howard would know. All right, members, other questions? Oh, Tim?
And just to remind everybody, we've actually gone on record about this, and this is in our comments, the review committee's comments on the proposed rule. This committee had recommended that one way to minimize the burden of the collection of information would be for the Department of the Interior, in consultation with Indian tribes, to prepare a single online source that will identify which tribes are geographically affiliated with specific locations. The Department of the Interior is the most logical place for this source to be located because of the Secretary's responsibility for both implementing NAGPRA and ensuring the government's trust responsibilities to Indian tribes. I don't want to bash Melanie in terms of pulling that down, because the data set was what the data set was. But I do think that the idea of a single definitive source hosted by the Department of the Interior in consultation with the tribes is probably the way to go.
Tim? I guess, again, the 5 entities I cited earlier, and the total ignorance by the entities to comply with NAGPRA. This report needs to help us with those entities understanding that the law is the law and it can't be ignored. So that is a comment, and then a question for Melanie. Because these entities, museums, universities, federal agencies, just blatantly ignore and not comply with the NAGPRA law. So the question, Melanie, is legally, is there options that can be considered legally?
Well, certainly there are options for making allegations of failure to comply in the civil penalty process under NAGPRA. There are limitations to that process. First and foremost, identifying the specific failure to comply. And we often see that can be an issue under the existing regulations, where a museum, for example, may have completed an inventory and is consulting with the tribe, but has not, for some reason, published a notice. There may not be a very clear failure to comply there, and it may be difficult to find that failure. So in some ways there are limitations there. Of course, there are other avenues for legal remedies outside of a civil penalty process through other legal actions that a tribe may wish to engage in through a court. But I will add that it is certainly the department's hope that changes to the regulations will improve the process for museums, and certainly to hold museums accountable to a process, and to ensure that there are timelines and clear instructions for completing this work. That is the goal of the revisions to these regulations.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. That's all.
So members, now that we've all had the chance to review the report, the draft report, are we, let's take a temperature check. Are we prepared to move forward with it, or should we wait to the November 30th meeting?
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Armin.
I'm ready to move forward with it. But again, Kim, to cite that there needs to be highlights in this report to the GAO, to the National Park Service, Department of the Interior, and museums and universities, and federal agencies that do not comply with NAGPRA. Can we do that, Tim?
Can you clarify what you mean by highlights? What would we do to the report?
Well, the highlight would be bring attention to. And these 5 entities that cited, they need to pay attention to the highlights of the report. So whether, you know, and that could be done in a number of ways, but this report can do that. It can bring attention to non-compliance and who's non-compliant.
Can I ask then, is it necessarily a change to the text, or is it
No.
more about the distribution?
Distribution.
Okay, easy enough to do.
Okay, thank you.
And then to clarify that the information that we were waiting on, specifically tables 2, 3, 4, and 5 regarding civil penalties, that will be included in the APR report, correct, Melanie? So that would complete the information that we're waiting on for the report. Meaning that it'll be covered in, maybe not in our report, but it will be in the department's program.
Yes, that is correct. It will be in the department's, in the program's report.
So Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the last of the information that we are requesting for review.
If I could,
Go ahead, go
it-
ahead.
Angela Garcia Lewis was able to provide a comment in the chat. I think she was suggesting maybe some formatting changes might provide the highlighting that Armand was requesting.
Tip.
Okay, I'm just trying to figure out logistically how to do this. If, let's say, we vote to approve this, pending highlighting formatting changes, can we authorize the chair to approve those so that we don't have to come back and do it?
Members?
Are we able to approve this report today if it does still require those minor edits? Either removing that section on the non-compliance or just editing it to reference the other report?
You can make non-substantive edits, so I would consider substantive edits to be changes to your recommendations, changes to the substance of the report. So as long as what we're talking about is formatting or other kinds of non-substantive edits, that would be fine. You could approve the report and then make those edits.
And I see in the comments, Angela's response, yes, that's fine.
I would, Mr. Chair, I would like to go ahead and move to approve the report to Congress with the possible just minor changes that we were just discussing.
So moved. Is there a second?
Second.
That would be Armand. Discussion. Any further discussion? With the understanding that formatting and non-substantive edits will be.
Question?
Is that, I'm sorry, is that Toby or is that Armand?
Yeah,
Toby.
that was me.
Yes, Toby.
Yeah, I want to move ahead with the report along with the changes.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Having heard none, can we do a voice vote? All in favor of adopting the of approving our FY 2023 report to Congress? Please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any nays? Any abstentions? None?
If I could just have Angela confirm a yes vote in the chat if she's able to do that at some point. And I'll just clarify for the record that Toby and Armand both agreed. I didn't hear those separately.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, then it's everybody has agreed. I'll wait.
Angela, if you can hear us?
I agree. I was having a hard time unmuting and I'm
Excellent.
this version of I'm on my iPhone. I'm normally on Android.
Thank you,
Great,
Angela.
thank you. That takes care of it for our record keeping then.
Is there any further steps we need to take? We're good.
Yes, that's fine.
All right, thank you, Melanie. The next section of the agenda.
Yes,
If I might, one of the issues that in the past we have had concern about is the amount of time it takes from our final report to when the department actually sends it to Congress and what that list is going to be. I think it would be useful if we could make sure that Melanie has the final by the next meeting. And we can discuss at that point the distribution part, which I think we've spent a lot of time on, and Armin has raised some issues to make sure that people got this.
Thank you. Agreed. Comments? Melody, that works in terms of process, yeah?
yes, we can discuss distribution at your next meeting.
Any further discussion on the report to Congress? None. Thank you, Armin and Toby. Thank you, everyone, for the work that was done on this report and getting it approved. So back to you, Melanie.
Yes, the next item on the agenda is time for public comment. At every meeting of the review committee, there is an opportunity for public comment, which is a requirement under FACA. If you are interested in providing public comment, you may do so by raising your hand through the Zoom feature. Or you can send a chat. I've just turned on the chat feature to request to make a public comment. The review committee can also accept written comments prior to a meeting or during a meeting, although it can sometimes be a little difficult for me to get a written comment during the meeting. It's better to send those in prior to the meeting. So if anybody would like to provide a public comment, you may do so by raising your hand using the Zoom function, and I will allow you to speak. I forgot to find the instructions for raising your hand by phone. I think we have a couple of people who have called in. Let me see if I can find that really quickly. Or you can submit your name in the chat if you prefer that to raising a hand.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Toby.
I would just like to say that I'm thankful to be here on the committee. This is my first meeting. I worked 28 years with Cultural Resources Department here with the Confederated Tribes of Minnesota. I had some dealings with NAGPRA and ARPA and whatnot, but this right here gives me an opportunity to truly see the extension of my work being out in the field. Now I get to come in and do this part here, like the close and protection for what I've been finding out there in the field and seeing this, you know, the extension of it, of what happens to those things after we find them in the field. After we find them in the field, it comes here to the committee and, you know, maybe not all of them, but I am really thankful to be on this committee because listening to, you know, my big brother Armin here and what he was saying, I had a lot of questions my own self, but I just wanted to come in and listen, pay attention and see how things go. And you know, one of the things that I heard was how out of compliance it is with these departments that, you know, don't like. They just don't, you know, meet to the requirements of the law. I mean, the simplicities of life, they say is, you know, you get pushed over to the side if you're too nice or something. Or we don't have enough funding or something, you know, I mean, it's always something like that, but what we're doing here, we're Native people asking to take care of our loved ones. And all we want is a little respect from these other departments that don't respect our laws, that don't see this, that don't see the job that, you know, all of you guys are doing, you know, Melanie and your staff, you know, what Armin said earlier, I agree with, you know, I mean, having good staff people do the work that you're doing, what that report that you gave earlier, Melanie, it was, yeah, I agree with Armin, it was really good report hearing all that stuff. But, you know, it's, to me, it's kind of hard when I hear that other department, and it's not just here in Oregon, you know, it's all over, it's all over the United States where we're still disrespected, like, in a way, it's almost like I'm saying it. And that trust responsibility, you know, I've been hearing a lot about that, and since I've been on, because this is my first term. My first term being on tribal council, being a tribal leader. I really enjoy it. I enjoy being here. I know the difficulties and everything. Sometimes you have to say things that ain't comfortable. But at the same time, it comes from your heart and it means something. It has to mean something to somebody. Somebody has to hear that. You know, we want to advance as Indian people, but there's a way that we are, and we will always remain to be that. We're not trying to change anything of who we are. We just want to be respected by those outside agencies. I guess that's what I'm saying. You know, that's kind of my frustrations hearing that non-compliance, just not meeting the law, just not coming forward with it. So I just wanted to make that comment and really thankful for all of you that's on the committee, and my first time getting to see I see a bunch of names. Now I got to put the face to those names, and I'm really thankful for that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those powerful words, and welcome to the committee.
Yes, thank you very much, Toby. And it is a little difficult to start your first meeting virtually, and I apologize that it wasn't quite the welcome that we would have if we were able to do this in person. So thank you for those comments. At this time, we don't have anyone with a hand raised. If you have called in and you would like to make a public comment, you may do so by pressing *9 to raise your hand from the phone. I did find the instructions. Otherwise, if you're joining us by computer, you can type in the chat, or you can raise your hand using the Zoom feature. As Armand likes to remind everyone, this is your time. This is your opportunity to speak to the committee. This is your chance to share with the committee your experiences in NAGPRA. Could someone please raise their hand so I can make sure it's actually working? Okay. All right, now lower your hand unless you want to actually make a comment. All right, it was working. All right. Okay, I do see a hand raised. Sarah, if you'd like to make a comment, I can unmute you. Sarah Childers, you can unmute.
Hello, can everyone hear
Hello.
me?
Yes.
Hello, I am the assistant TIPO here at the Flanders Santee Sioux Tribe. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for all the work you do. I'm seeing a lot of improvement over the past several years in notices and how fast, they get them out from the museums. Again, I think you addressed the Smithsonian, but I'd like a more push, I think, from the Department of Interior to the Smithsonian on releasing the items that came from the punitive campaigns against the Native Americans that went to the War Museum or the medical war museums. We have been told for decades that those are off limits, that those are not up for repatriation. I don't know why. So I guess we need some clarification from the Smithsonian on why those are being held still and haven't been up as part of NAGPRA. That's been a pretty strong one. And with all the Ochedi Shikoe, we have quite a few remains in those collections. So if museums have to give back the war items and those war booty items from those punitive campaigns, why isn't the Smithsonian held the same way with the actual human remains? And those associated items are being repatriated by other museums. So the other thing was with the Forest Service, if they can give us an idea of places for repatriation, specifically, I think the Black Hills is what we're looking for, to find a location for a lot of these unaffiliated remains. And I think that was our only 2 comments from the office for now. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Sarah, for your comments.
Thanks, Sarah. This is Tim. I just got a text from Hale Aloha that he's just lost power,
Oh,
so is offline. So I guess I'm chair. I guess that's why you have a vice chair. Okay, more questions, more comments from, oh, he's back.
Sorry, lost power.
Oh.
What did I miss?
I just seized control, but now I'm ceding it back.
Are there any additional comments or questions?
We have one question in the chat, which I will read out. But I might need to call on Stephen to answer. The question is how the recent redefining of Alaska regional entities under the CARES Act has changed or affected NAGPRA.
The commenter is referring to the litigation concerning the definition of Indian tribe under the CARES Act. When Congress passed that, they used the definition from the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, which includes Alaskan Native corporations. When Congress passed NAGPRA, they specifically and intentionally excluded Alaska Native corporations. And so since the corporations are not a tribe under NAGPRA, the CARES Act decision from the Supreme Court had no effect on the implementation of NAGPRA at all.
Thank you, Stephen. Are there any other public comments? Can raise your hand, or you can make a post in the chat. Okay, we have a comment in the chat that I will read out. It seems the pace on notices and repatriations have been moving in a good way. However, that's been true based on the current speed at which institutions are offering access to their collections. As Armand and Toby noted eloquently, those institutions are withholding mountains of information on collections. My question is how ready we are and how we can use this report to push for the administrative and bureaucratic changes, not only to improve their compliance to meet current regulatory standards, but also the upcoming regulations. Ostensibly, there will be more notices, repatriations, requests, etc. How will we be ready for that?
Yeah, my comment would be, I'm not sure if I would be answering it directly, but one important way to improve that ability for repatriations to occur, is the section of the report that where institutions identified their costs, their staff costs and costs to comply and to expedite NAGPRA repatriation. I cannot emphasize more the need. That's why I asked the question early on, if what can be done to advocate for the department to increase its ask from Congress for agencies and federally funded museums to carry out, especially the ones with the large collections, to carry out the important consultations and move those repatriations along. We've been hearing this theme of lack of resources for a long time. So if our report can help move the bar, increase that amount, then I think that would be one effective way to be able to do so. And I wanted to thank Tim and the subcommittee for all their work in requesting that information in Indiana and culling that information and incorporating it into our report. Any other comments, members? Or Melanie? I'm sorry, Tim, you have a comment?
I didn't want to disrupt the public stuff. I have a kind of a different issue. As you probably realize, I'm an old retired guy, so I spend much of my time looking at Federal Register notices. And one of the notices that I commented on at the Bloomington meeting was related to the Tennessee Valley Authority. And I raised some issues about it, but I wanted to point out that in the public comment section, there's actually a letter that followed up, I think, on what I said and did it in a much clearer way than I ever did. So I just want to thank them for highlighting that issue. I do have on another issue, another notice that I've seen recently. I actually have a question for Brady and Stephen, if I could. This relates to a notice that was published recently by a museum in California, and it relates to culturally unidentifiable remains. And in terms of determining Aboriginal land, Aboriginal territory, they've relied on 3 sources. 2 of them, Treaty E and Treaty M, are the unratified treaties that were done in California that were sent to the president, but never affirmed by the Senate. And I kind of looked back at the way the current regulations read that says that they have to be from the Indian Claims Commission, Court of Claims, Treaty, Act of Congress, or Executive Order. That's the current language. But I know that the proposed rule has broadened that to include treaties sent to the President of the United States for ratification. I think these 2 treaties were indeed sent to the President for ratification. I guess my question, one question to you is whether the current regulatory text is sufficient to give those 2 documents authoritative, to make them authoritative documents.
I'd actually recommend that this question start with Melanie and,
Okay.
along the lines of advice that is given as technical assistance by the National NAGPRA program. So before looping in the solicitor's office, I think it's a good place to start with the program. Melanie, you okay with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. When it comes to Aboriginal land in California, our advice is that the unratified treaties in California are part and parcel of the later Court of Claims decision, as well as the Indian Claims Commission decisions, and so are therefore authoritative governmental sources.
That's excellent. I've long been a proponent of that interpretation, so excellent. In reading that notice, I noticed that there is a 3rd authority, which is the California Native American Heritage Commission Native American Contact List, which is not a federal document. That one makes me a little uncomfortable. You citing it as an authority for making those decisions, would that be consistent with your thoughts as well or not?
Well, that would be the museum that cited that as the authority for their determinations. And I would I would say that it met the requirements of the National NAGPRA program for us to publish the notice.
So you have,
And
sorry.
that I understand your concern, and I would have concerns about that authority on its own, but coupled with the the treaties. It was sufficient to meet our requirements for publication.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
I'll add one point from a legal perspective that I know many folks in different states are often trying to balance the requirements of both federal and state requirements. And to the extent the department can be flexible in helping people move towards repatriation and addressing both those federal and state requirements at the same time, the department wants to do that. It wants to be helpful. So to Melanie's point, while a notice, the review for the department here is whether the notice is sufficient, contains the information that it needs to be sufficient. There are times when there might be other inclusions in a notice at the choice of a museum to help address its other obligations or provide notice of its compliance with other state laws that are outside the scope of National NAGPRA's purview.
I guess my recommendation is to keep the notices clean. And to, obviously, in California, they have two sets of responsibilities, one under state law, one under federal law. And when you acknowledge the state law provisions in the federal one, it muddies things up.
Thank you.
Which is a segue into my my thought that we should have a meeting in California.
I guess at some point we need to discuss what our preferred venue would be for the next in-person review committee meeting, and be prepared to make recommendations to Melanie about that.
We have those recommendations from your last discussion, so we're prepared and have been moving forward with those plans. I just want to circle back because we did not effectively close our public comment period, and I want to be sure that there's no one else who wished to make a public comment. This is another opportunity to raise your hand or put your name in the chat. Okay, Mr. Chair, I do not see any other comments. Oh, I do see a question. There's a question in the chat. It's a bit of a challenge here in that public comments are a little difficult to manage. They really shouldn't be anonymous, and I've been treating them as such, and I'm going to continue this way, but I need to manage this differently. We will be sure to post this. We'll need to identify, Lisa, we're going to have to figure this out because this is not working. Yes, actually, Wendy, if you wouldn't mind, I would be happy to unmute you so you can ask. That would be best.
Yeah, I didn't have a problem with that, and it might make it easier. So I noticed that
Please,
Tim had
sorry, if you could
Can you
please
hear me?
identify yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Wendy Teeter, retired curator of archaeology for the Fowler Museum and cultural resources archaeologist for San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians. One of the most problem or difficult issues is having to deal with federal collections and universities and the different levels of requirements that each different federal agency wanted to establish that this was a collection that was in their control. And there was only one federal agency that had not done any due diligence in reporting their collections at UCLA, and that was the Bureau of Indian Affairs Museum Trust. And I have still not seen, I was there for over 30 years, and I have still not seen them take control and report any of the collections that they had at UCLA. So I'm wondering, under these provisions that Timothy McEwen mentioned, how are you going to ensure that this actually happens, that these collections are even accounted for, let alone being included in the numbers that we see in like the GAO report? Thank you.
If no one's answering, obviously ensuring that federal agencies comply with the statute is somewhat more problematic than it is for museums. With museums, you have the opportunity of going through an administrative procedure for civil penalties. I think one of our issues is that civil penalties have tended not to be investigated as fulsomely as maybe they need to be. However, there is a process, an administrative process that is relatively inexpensive to initiate. With federal agencies, you don't have that. Going to court is very expensive. The one place that is useful is if there is a clear violation of federal law, is to go to that agency's Office of the Inspector General. And is their charge to investigate violations of federal law by their agency.
Well, I will just add that this is, Wendy, an issue that the department has addressed through the proposed regulations by requiring federal agencies respond to museum statements about federal holdings or collections. It is obviously a well-known issue, and one that we hope will be resolved under the regulations through a requirement for museums to report on federal holdings or collections, and then for federal agencies to respond and to attach timeframes to both of those. Mr. Chair, I think that concludes all of the agenda items for today's meeting.
Any final comments before we close the meeting?
Chair,
Yes, I'm.
Melanie, can we, I guess, restart the discussion we had on our in-person meeting, the places, and maybe a time frame of when that in-person meeting could be?
We certainly can. I did not have Lisa prepare that for me yet. I plan to talk about that at your next meeting on November 30th, but Lisa, do you have that at hand? I know we started the discussions already with the University of California, Berkeley.
Yes, that would be what I would say. We've started the discussions with the University of California, Berkeley. Sorry, my dog thinks that everybody talking means they get a treat. As well as other museums in California. And then we have also noted Armin's suggestion that we meet in Wisconsin.
So Melanie, do we have I guess a window or a specific window in spring that we could meet in person?
I
Go
would
ahead,
jump
Lisa.
in. I would jump in and say that if we're meeting at a university, their preference is almost always that we meet in the summer months when there's a break from students being on campus. So that is something that could come into play. It's not an absolute, but that could affect the timing of the meeting. For Berkeley would be what I'm thinking of.
Well, Melanie, that kind of narrows things down. Maybe you suggest, Mr. Chair, that our next meeting be in Green Bay in person in the spring.
So noted.
Thank you.
Are there any last matters before we close the meeting?
Melanie, when's our next Zoom meeting?
The last day of the month, November 30th.
November 30,
Yes,
the same time?
yes, sir.
Okay. Hey, Melanie,
Yes, sir.
I'm having problems with my second paper that I'm trying to send to you. It's not accepting my zip code. Do I just leave that and just send it to you because I already have my zip code on my other paper? For some reason or another, it's not allowing me to move beyond the zip code.
Yes, I will have Lisa reach out to you, but I think she can probably fill that in for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, but with that, I think I'll move to close the meeting and offer a closing prayer.
Certainly. Before you start that, would you like me to stop the recording?
Yes, please.